you very much. Can everyone hear me? Thank you very much. And to John and the committee and everybody who's here, thank you. This has been an extraordinary conference for me so far, and I hope we can have some more conversations after this. I've been asked to talk about light pollution and human health, and the slide here is actually an older NASA one. It's a composite image that they did in 2019, and it's looking at the changes in light at night across the period 2012 to 2016. And the purple areas are where there has, in that time period, been growth in the amount of light at night. And I left this old slide up here. We've seen some much more recent data, but I left it up because it emphasizes the point about change, the increasing amount of light at night. And that's a theme that I want to touch on in a couple of areas of my talk. I'll get this the right way around. So I'm going to introduce my home discipline, which is chronobiology. Who's heard that? Oh, this is an educated audience. People have given, ahead of me have given a little bit of their background. Mine is quick. When I said I wanted to do chronobiology for my master's thesis in zoology in 1975, the physiology professor said it was a lunatic fringe discipline and a waste of good student. My first postdoc, I was a Fulbright Fellow at Harvard Medical School, and from there I was recruited by NASA. And I spent 13 years working for NASA, and then came back to New Zealand and set up the Sleep-Wake Research Centre, so I've worked for nearly 50 years as a chronobiologist. There you go. I'm going to talk about sleep as an integral part of life, which is not necessarily the way we view it, because it is impacted by light, and I am going to talk about shift work. I could talk about a lot of other things, but not in half an hour. The other thing I would say is that you will see some differences between a chronobiological perspective on some of these things and a medical perspective that we heard from Mario this morning. And they're just different approaches to the same issues. So I don't think anybody in the room here would disagree with the idea that life on the planet is adapted to atmosphere and gravity. What chronobiology adds is that life on Earth is adapted to the predictable environmental changes that we have. The environment on Earth is not constant, and living species have to be able to cope with those regular changes that are driven by the geophysical cycles. So we're talking about, primarily today, we're talking about the rotation of the Earth on its axis, which gives us the day-night cycle. But we do have innate biological rhythms in life on Earth, and we know a lot more about the circadian, the daily ones, than we do about the others. But there are innate rhythms that are a response to the cycle of the moon, the orbit of the moon around the Earth, the changes across the lunar cycle, new moon to full moon, particularly in marine species, and also, of course, the tidal effects caused by the moon. And there are innate rhythms that are adaptations, we have them, to the orbit of the Earth and the Sun, so the seasonal cycles. And light pollution is relevant to all of these. Circadian rhythms, circa about a diem a day. Why are they called circa rhythms? All of them are circa rhythms. Because the innate biological rhythms don't have exactly the same periodicity as the geophysical cycles. They are slightly different from the geophysical cycles, and they rely on time cues from the geophysical cycles to stay in step with the outside world. And this is suddenly where light becomes super important. If I were going to put you into a time isolation laboratory, done that to a few people, no windows, no access to clocks, watches, internet, phone, anything that gives you time in the outside world. You choose when you're going to go to bed, when you're going to get up. You choose when you eat, you choose what you're going to do in between. In that environment, most of us will live a day-night cycle, a sleep-wake cycle, slightly longer than 24 hours. The innate periodicity of your circadian system is not exactly 24. Very few of us will have an innate period which is a bit less than 24. And we need regular cues, and those regular cues we need, surprise, surprise, unlight cues to keep our system synchronized by the day-night cycle. We've already seen this morning from Mario's talk. People sometimes express skepticism about chronobiology as a field, but 3 chronobiologists have won Nobel Prize for Physiology or Medicine. And I also put this up because it gives you an indication of how much knowledge there is in our field, which we have not communicated adequately. But we know down to the molecular level how this works. And this is just a little reminder that we're not only talking about human beings here, because every cell-based life form on Earth, we share these adaptations with algae, with plants, with fungi, with any other species you want to think about. Circadian rhythmicity, innate rhythms, adapting your behaviour to the day-night cycle belong to every species on Earth. So this has a sort of consequence immediately for sleep. Sleeping at night is not a social convention. It's not an inconvenience. It's actually genetically programmed. And Mario spoke a lot about the circadian clock genes. We have them in every cell in your body. They're active in a lot of cells compared to most genes. And what they're doing is they're producing a daily cycle in the concentrations of proteins. And those proteins are going out and interacting with other parts of the cell. And so all of your cells are functioning rhythmically. All your tissues, all your organs, every cell in your body is rhythmic. And then we think about, if you think about the analogy of a symphony orchestra, if your organs are all doing something, if you think about a symphony orchestra, you've got the string section, you've got the brass section, you've got the woodwind, you've got the percussion, and if they're all just doing their own thing, you get a horrible noise. And the same is true for the circadian timing system. We need a conductor to keep all of these different rhythms in sync with each other. We have one. We have a circadian master clock in the hypothalamus. And it actually has 2 jobs. One of them is keeping all of your internal rhythms in step with each other. And it does that through 2 mechanisms. It uses messenger hormones. It controls the concentration of melatonin, and it controls the concentration of cortisol. That's one of the ways that it communicates with other parts of the body. And then it also has direct neural connections to other parts of the brain. So it's also managing all the other rhythms via neural connections. And its ecological, environmental purpose, if you like, its evolutionary purpose, keeping you in step with the day-night cycle, is done by having sensitivity to blue light. Oh dear. It has blue light sensitive cells in the retina that connect directly to that part of the hypothalamus where the circadian master clock is. This is not part of the visual system. This is independent of the visual system. And they're called melanopsin cells. That's the name of the blue light pigment, which is in them. And the thing that makes this interesting from a chronobiological point of view is that the way it works is that if you get light in the morning, that will accelerate. It'll shorten the cycle. And so if you're like most of us and you have a slightly longer than 24-hour natural clock period, light in the morning will bring it back into 24 hours. At the other end of the day, in the evening, light in the evening has the opposite effect. It lengthens the cycle. So that if you're one of the few people who has a natural period shorter than 24 hours, that's the light you need to be pulled into a 24-hour cycle. But most of us are getting light in the evening with a high blue content, thank you for the LEDs, and that is actually delaying your circadian master clock. It makes it harder to go to sleep. It makes it harder to wake up in the morning. The whole mechanism is being pushed later. The way the circadian clock controls sleep is that at some parts of its cycle, it's stimulating wake-promoting areas of the brain, And at other parts of its cycle, it's promoting its sleep, it's pushing sleep-promoting areas of the brain. So it's actually like a seesaw, swinging on this side and then on that side. And that's how it's making you sleepy at night, basically. I wanted to just make a couple of comments about melatonin because there's a lot of confusion about melatonin. And one of the things that's a concern to me is how quickly we've adopted it without knowing the full extent of its activities. So it's synthesized in the pineal gland, and your circadian master clock turns on the synthesis of melatonin just before your usual bedtime, and it turns it off just before you wake up. There's another effect, which Mario mentioned this morning, which is the light over about 350 lux for most people. There's quite a lot of variability in that. Will actually suppress melatonin secretion, even though your circadian master clock is telling the pineal to do this. So it can be suppressed by light. And the other thing which is of interest is that it's high at night. In us, we sleep at night. It's also high at night in rodents that are active at night. Melatonin is high in the brain of all mammalian species at night. So this is where you start to think it's a bit simplistic to think that it's a sleeping pill. There's a lot more that could be said. What changes you from being diurnal or nocturnal, or whatever you are, or changing across the seasons, is actually further down in the brain and the also medial hypothalamus, if you really need to know. It's not the circadian pacemaker. It has the same orientation to the day-night cycle. So why am I so enthralled by sleep? Because it's a third of a cycle and you have the same brain and body 24 hours a day. Coming from a chronobiological perspective, you can't understand waking function and waking health unless you also understand the other third, sleeping function and sleeping health. And so why do we do it for so long? Well, the simple message really is that when you are, there's a very bright light there that's getting in my eye. When you are awake and active, your brain is very occupied dealing with all the information coming in from the environment. Your senses are pumping in tons of stuff. You've got to be just looking out there and seeing what you're going to do next and then doing it, getting organised to do it. The brain is very busy interacting with the environment when you're awake. It needs to go offline to do a whole lot of other vital things, and it can't do that when it's so preoccupied with looking at the environment. And so what happens is when you fall asleep, gradually you become more and more disconnected. Your brain is not listening to what's coming in from the environment, not looking at what's coming in from the environment. And sleep is not an off time. It's a very complex series of processes. The brain reconfigures itself into two completely different versions while they're asleep, and they're completely different from wakefulness. Pretty miraculous, really. Makes me a bit of a cynic about artificial intelligence, but that's another story. And one kind of sleep, which you've probably all heard of, is rapid eye movement sleep, which is associated with dreaming. And then your brain looks pretty, the electrical activity in your brain looks a bit like being awake. But you have a block in the brainstem, so you can't act out what you're dreaming about. Very important adaptation, that, because you're not actually taking any information from the environment. So if you're running around or jumping off tall buildings, as I sometimes do in my dreams because I can fly, it's just as well that you can't act out. There are a few sleep disorders where it goes wrong, and people do, and they get into difficulty. The other kind of sleep is completely different. We very imaginatively call it non-rapid eye movement sleep. And what's going on there is overall, as you go deeper and deeper and deeper into what we call non-REM sleep, the brain activity overall is slowing down, and when you get into really deep sleep, we have what we call slow wave. We have a vast number of cells in your brain all firing together, very slow, big rhythm, like a Mexican wave of a football match. And so the brain is going through all these different stages, and it's doing different vital things. Or you go about every 90 minutes into a REM period. You start off into non-REM, and then you go about every 90 minutes into REM. And what's going on? Well, memory consolidation and learning. Sleep is vital. This is a third of your life in one slide, so forgive me if it's a bit broad. Emotional regulation appears to be happening across the successive REM periods particularly. Repair of tissue, development, growth. You can only secrete growth hormone when you are in deep non-REM sleep, when you've got that big vexicant wave going on. And so children who have chronic sleep problems tend to be small for their age because they never get to secrete enough growth hormone. You recharge your immune system, and Mario mentioned this as well. If you have a vaccination, a number of studies that have looked at this, and then you get normal sleep the next night, you will have a much higher antibody titer than somebody who is forced to stay awake for the next night. And that effect can be seen a year out in some forms of vaccination. The sleep you get after a vaccination is vital for the effectiveness of the vaccine. Regulation of appetite, I think Alexander's going to talk about this a bit more, but if you restrict people in the lab, make them get up early, what you see is the hormone that makes you hungry, ghrelin, increases, and the hormone that makes you feel full, leptin, decreases. And there are clear metabolic effects of sleep restriction. So it is not an off time. The brain is off doing other vital things. If you take nothing else from this talk, please remember that. Okay. This is incredible. You wake up an updated version of yourself. All of your experiences from yesterday have been integrated and you're charged up physically and mentally and ready to go again. It's really quite good, this. Don't undervalue it. And one of the immediate problems that comes up, of course, here in this context is that light at night, artificial light, access to artificial light, enables, and I would say in a lot of settings encourages, unhealthy sleep patterns. You're fighting your circadian system. So what happens if you don't get enough sleep? Well, in the short term, you don't function as well in every aspect of your waking. You may think you're okay, you're not good at judging that. The effects of sleep restriction accumulate. That light is driving me mad, I might come over here. They accumulate, so if I'm getting up 2 hours early every day of the week to go to work for 5 days, I'm 10 hours in debt by Friday. On Friday, I will not be functioning anywhere near as well as I was on Monday, providing I've caught up over the weekend. And if you don't have enough sleep, you feel sleepy. Duh. We accept that if we are hungry, we need to eat, and if we're thirsty, we need to drink. If we're sleepy, we're not motivated, we're unprofessional, we're not trying hard enough. It's not the same. It's not the case. These are all brain signals that you're not meeting a vital physiological need. As you are getting sleepier, your reaction time is slowing down, and so is your information processing in the brain. Your coordination is getting less reliable, as is memory recall, vital at my age. Your risk assessment, you tend to make more risky choices. And there are some spectacular accidents that have resulted from that, including the explosion of the Space Shuttle Challenger, but we don't have time to talk about that in detail. Your communication decreases. You may be less communicative, or you may not be communicating very clearly. And you are probably less pleasant to be around. You lose your situation awareness. When you're suddenly faced with a very complex situation, a lot of my work has been with international airline pilots. Something's come on and you've got to respond to an emergency sitting in the cockpit. Suddenly you've got a huge amount of information coming in. You've got a whole lot of critical decisions to make. You've got to choose a course of action, you've got to do it. And a tired brain can't do that. And what we tend to do is we tend to exclude some of the information. We look at the stuff that's more familiar. And we focus on that and we leave out often very important parts of the picture. because your tired brain can't do it all at once. And the other thing that happens is that you may be okay for 15 or 20 minutes driving when you're sleeping, but then you uncontrollably will go off and be much worse. You're much more variable in your performance and you get worse and worse at judging it, which is really important to know for your own safety. In the end, you fall asleep uncontrollably. Unfortunately, I've been an expert witness in a heap of a lot of accidents when people have fallen asleep driving. You can drive as fall asleep in a life-threatening situation. People do it all the time in cars. And that is because the brain's need for sleep becomes so strong that you can't voluntarily stop it. You go into shorter periods of being disconnected, and if you're in a place where you can, you go into a full non-REM cycle. So that's what happens in the short term. What about in the long term? There are very big data sets on all of these. They're in physical health. If you have a chronic sleep problem or you're chronically not getting enough sleep, you are more likely to be obese. These are getting to be familiar, aren't they? Impaired glucose tolerance, type 2 diabetes, cardiovascular disease, poor general health, and dying earlier of all causes. Mental health. Similarly, if you don't get enough sleep on a regular basis, depression, increased risk of all of these symptoms and aspects of mental health. And I would recommend to any of you who are interested in this, there's a very, very thorough review of the literature done recently by the UK Royal Society for Public Health, where it is written for a non-specialist audience. They review the literature in these areas and then they give some very important recommendations about what we should be doing about it. So sleep is not only diet and exercise, and we use this model of health is not just diet and exercise. We use this model of a three-legged stool. Sleep is the third leg. Oh my goodness, I've got a long way to go. Sorry, we'll skip. Okay. I want to talk about shift work because from a physiological point of view, it's any work pattern that requires you to be awake when you would be asleep. And about 20% of the global workforce is doing night work. The light-sensitive circadian master clock does not adapt to a work pattern which is out of step with the day-night cycle in the vast majority of instances. So our shift workers are working during the biological night, when they're programmed to be asleep, and less productive, high error rates and accident rates and drowsy driving. And then they're trying to sleep in the wrong part of the circadian cycle, and you can't get as much sleep, and it's often disrupted by environmental factors and other people in your lives. There's another thing going on. I've talked about light synchronizing the master clock. Eating is also a cue to your digestive system. The clock's in the organs in your digestive system. If you eat a hamburger in the middle of the night, your master clock is telling your brain, hang on, you should be asleep, you should be fasting, it's dark outside. And your hamburger is telling your body, hang on, we've got to get revved up here and eat all this fatty gunge. There's just all this fatty gunge. And so you have conflicting inputs in terms of time cues, and that ends up causing major metabolic disruption. And there's a similar thing that goes on with physical exercise. It can reset some of the tissues and organs in your body. And so it can be out of step with the day-night cycle. So you have out of step internally and externally, and health and safety effects of shift work. There's not much data in New Zealand. This is an old study. 15,000 New Zealanders who did a survey after they'd given blood. About 20%, 21% were working some form of shift work. So rotating shifts, the time of work changes progressively. With or without nights or permanent night work, that's about 21% of the New Zealand population at that stage. And when you look at all the other factors, you allow statistically for all the other factors that might be increasing your risk of a workplace accident. Age, gender, training, type of work, all the factors that might be affecting the outcomes. When you take out all of those factors, there's still an independent effect of working rotating shift work, which doubles your likelihood of having a workplace injury in the last year that had to be treated by a doctor. New Zealand data. This is a study which I think you also mentioned this morning. This is one of the big ones, and what we've done here is traced nurses over a long period of time. And what's good about this is comparing apples with apples. And so, they're comparing nurses who work 3 or more nights per month with nurses who don't. And they are doing regular medicals. This is not self-report. And from day one, nurses doing those 3 or more nights a month are at increased risk of gaining weight, type 2 diabetes and breast cancer, as we saw this morning. At 5 years, they're at increased risk of death from all causes and from cardiovascular disease. At 15 years, increased risk of death from lung cancer and stroke and colorectal cancer. There is something very wrong about what we're doing to our bodies in this context. There's also a Danish study which has shown an increase in Alzheimer's risk. And this is also something that I think we spoke about this morning. Light intensity, and a lot of marine species rely on the lunar cycle for coordinating breeding, for example. One more. And we and many other species, everything from algae to us, have internal annual rhythms, similar kind of mechanism where there's an internal clock system. And light at night is also destroying the seasonal cues, which are the changes in day length. So this is a very big ecological problem as well as a very big human problem. And that's where I would leave the talk. Thank you.
From a medical point of view, the research that you're doing in New Zealand, have you also considered the indoor applications of lighting and blue light, specifically in terms of televisions, iPads, and computer screens as well, which obviously...
Our lab has not, but there is a lot of work in that space, and there are a lot of technical solutions to that. But I think to motivate people to actually use them, you need the sort of information that we've just been talking about here. Because I think a lot of people don't understand why you're telling them suddenly you can't watch your, play on your high blue light phone or whatever. But there is a lot of work going on in that area, not specifically in our group. Most of our work is working with industry, trying to bring the science into practice in shift work and jet lag situations to improve safety and health.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Talk. I'm an 8-week-old baby, so a lot of that feels depressingly familiar at the moment. I was wondering, in terms of humans, like that 24-hour cycle you talked about, how long does it take to establish? Does my baby have it already, or does it take a little while for that?
Your baby has a circadian system already, but what is evolving is developing particularly through the first year and up until about year 5 is the structure of sleep. And so babies spend a lot more time in what we would call it's active sleep. It's not quite full REM, but it's light REM. And then it takes them about 6 months before they get into that deep slow wave sleep, so then they're much harder to disturb and they stay asleep more easily. And you tend to, by the time you're, I'm trying to remember exactly, the amount of slow wave sleep changes across the lifespan. It increases to a maximum actually through the teenage years when you probably don't get enough of it, and then it declines over older age to where I am. But REM sleep settles at about 25% of the night by the time you're 5. So the sleep patterns, the brain development is involved in establishing the full... I talked about adult sleep patterns there. I didn't have time to talk about other, but that's what's going on.
One last question. Yeah.
Thanks, Philippa. That was really interesting. Are you aware of any sort of cost-benefit analysis in terms of the things that you just
Yes, there are cost-benefit analyses, not in relation to shift work, but certainly in relation to sleep and sleep disorders. The one that I usually cite is an Australian one, and the other side of that picture is that they have much better sleep disorders medicine, which is a medical specialty, but try introducing a new medical specialty in the New Zealand healthcare system at the moment. And so they have better outcomes actually. And I forget the exact figures, but it's something like 4%, 4.6% of total healthcare, the indirect costs of disease, the burden of disease in Australia is something like 1.2% of GDP annually can be attributed to sleep disorders, and that will be an underestimate.